Most people only hear music. Rare people hear the wound inside the note. The rain fell softly against the tall glass windows of the Holbrook Lounge, turning the Manhattan skyline into blurred rivers of gold and silver light. Inside, everything moved with expensive precision. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath dim chandeliers. Waiters in black vests floated silently between white linen tables. A slow jazz melody drifted through the air while executives discussed mergers worth more than entire neighborhoods. And at table 17, Nathaniel Reed never looked up. The 38-year-old billionaire sat alone beneath the glow of a hanging amber light, scrolling through financial reports on his phone while a half-finished espresso cooled beside his hand. His charcoal suit looked perfectly tailored. His silver watch reflected the restaurant lights every time his wrist moved. Everything about him suggested control, efficiency, distance. People in Manhattan either feared Nathaniel Reed or wanted something from him. Usually both. He had built Reed Capital into one of the most powerful investment firms in New York before turning 40, acquiring companies with the same emotional detachment most people used to organize files on a desktop. Employees described him as brilliant but impossible to read. Competitors called him ruthless. Nathaniel himself preferred one word: focused. Across the room, Claire Bennett quietly adjusted a stack of polished dessert plates near the service station. At 27, she blended into the restaurant, so naturally most guests barely noticed her unless they needed water refilled or a menu collected. Her blonde hair was tied back neatly. Her black uniform fit with clean simplicity. No jewelry except for a tiny silver ring on her right hand. No dramatic makeup. No attempt to attract attention. But there was something unusual about the way she moved. Calm. Measured. As if she listened to things nobody else heard. Table 17 asked for sparkling water again. Another waitress whispered while passing by. Claire nodded once. "I'll take it. Good luck." "Mr. Reed looks irritated tonight." Claire gave a faint smile that barely existed before disappearing again. "He usually does." She carried the glass bottle toward Nathaniel's table while the restaurant's elderly pianist continued playing near the center of the lounge. Arthur Whitmore was nearly 72 now, but in certain circles, his name still carried legendary weight. Once celebrated across Europe and New York concert halls, he had slowly disappeared from the public eye after the death of his wife nearly a decade earlier. Now he played quietly at the Holbrook 3 nights a week, hidden beneath soft lights and expensive conversations that rarely appreciated who he truly was. Nathaniel barely acknowledged Claire as she poured his water. "Anything else tonight, Mr. Reed?" she asked gently. No, his eyes never left the screen. Claire nodded politely and turned away. But before she reached the service station, something happened. One note. Tiny. Barely noticeable. The kind of mistake that dissolved instantly beneath the noise of conversation and clinking glasses. Arthur's left hand struck a slightly damaged harmonic in the middle register of the grand piano. Nobody reacted. Nobody except Claire. Her footsteps stopped. Her eyebrows tightened almost invisibly. And across the room, Arthur Whitmore suddenly stopped playing. The entire lounge shifted awkwardly as the unfinished melody dissolved into silence. Several guests looked up in confusion. A businessman near the bar chuckled softly, assuming the old pianist had simply forgotten the piece. Nathaniel sighed with annoyance and finally lifted his eyes from his phone. Arthur did not continue playing. Instead, the elderly pianist slowly turned his head toward the dining room. Toward Claire. His pale blue eyes narrowed with sudden intensity. Claire stood frozen beside the service station, one hand still resting against a tray of wine glasses. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Arthur quietly rose from the piano bench. The entire restaurant watched him walk across the marble floor toward the young waitress nobody had noticed 5 minutes earlier. Even Nathaniel's attention sharpened slightly now. Arthur stopped directly in front of Claire. Up close, the old pianist looked strangely emotional. Not confused. Not angry. Almost stunned. "You heard it," he said softly. Claire blinked once. "I'm sorry." The broken harmonic. Arthur's voice barely rose above the silence around them. "You heard it too, didn't you?" The room became completely still. Claire lowered her eyes for half a second. The A-string resonance drifted flat after the sustain pedal, she answered carefully. Just slightly. A wine glass slipped from a server's hand somewhere behind the bar. Nathaniel stared at her now. Fully stared. Arthur Whitmore's expression changed slowly into something almost reverent. "My God," he whispered. Then he laughed once under his breath, shaking his head gently like a man discovering a ghost from another lifetime. "There you are." Claire's face lost color instantly. "Sir." But Arthur was already looking at the piano again. Then back at her. "Do you know how many trained musicians sat in this room tonight and missed it?" Claire said nothing. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his chair, his phone forgotten in his hand. For the first time all evening, the billionaire no longer looked distracted. He looked curious. Arthur studied Claire for another long second before speaking again, louder this time, loud enough for nearby tables to hear clearly. "People spend entire lifetimes searching for ears like yours," he said quietly. "And somehow Manhattan hid you inside a waitress uniform." The silence that followed felt heavier than applause. Nobody moved for several seconds after Arthur Whitmore spoke. The chandeliers still glowed warmly above the dining room. Rain still traced soft rivers against the glass windows overlooking Park Avenue. Somewhere near the kitchen, silverware clinked faintly onto porcelain plates. But the atmosphere inside the Holbrook Lounge had changed completely. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Waiters stood awkwardly beside tables holding untouched wine bottles. And Claire Bennett looked like someone desperately wishing the marble floor beneath her would open quietly and let her disappear. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, careful enough not to draw more attention, "you are mistaken." Arthur studied her face with the patience of an old man who had spent decades understanding silence better than words. "No," he replied gently. "I do not believe I am." Nathaniel Reed watched the exchange with growing fascination. 5 minutes earlier, Claire Bennett had been invisible to him, another server in another expensive Manhattan restaurant. But now the room seemed to orbit around her stillness. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Arthur slowly turned back toward the piano. "Forgive me, ladies and gentlemen," he announced calmly to the guests. Age occasionally interrupts memory. A few nervous laughs scattered across the room, grateful for permission to breathe again. The old pianist returned to the grand piano beneath the amber lights and rested his fingers softly on the keys. But before beginning again, he deliberately struck the same damaged harmonic once more. Soft, quick, almost hidden beneath the room's returning noise. Claire closed her eyes for less than a second. Arthur smiled faintly without looking at her. Then he began playing again. This time the melody flowed through the lounge differently. Slower, deeper. Nathaniel noticed something strange. Claire no longer moved like a waitress trying to survive a shift. She moved like someone resisting an old instinct. Every time Arthur shifted tempo, her shoulders reacted almost invisibly. Every pause reached her before the audience heard it. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his untouched espresso cooling beside him. He had spent most of his life studying patterns, markets, human behavior, risk, opportunity. That instinct had made him billions. And right now, every instinct he possessed told him the same thing. Arthur Whitmore had not looked at Claire Bennett the way famous musicians looked at fans. He had looked at her the way experts recognized another expert. Across the room, Claire carried a tray of drinks toward a nearby table while trying very hard not to glance at the piano again. "You know him?" another server whispered beside her. Claire shook her head too quickly. "Not really." "Then why did Arthur Whitmore just look at you like he saw a ghost?" Claire forced a small smile. "I think he was being kind." But even she did not sound convinced. Nathaniel finally stood from his table. The movement alone shifted attention nearby because powerful men carried gravity even when silent. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal jacket and walked calmly toward the piano during the end of Arthur's next piece. Several diners discreetly watched him now. Nathaniel Reed rarely approached strangers unless he wanted something. Arthur finished the final note softly. Applause filled the room. Nathaniel waited until the sound faded. "You embarrassed her," he said quietly. Arthur glanced up with mild amusement. "Interesting. Most billionaires would have opened with hello." Nathaniel ignored the comment. She clearly did not want attention. "No," Arthur agreed. She did not. The old pianist folded his hands atop the piano keys, which is usually how you recognize the real ones. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "The real what?" Arthur looked toward Claire across the room. She was helping an elderly couple with dessert menus now, her expression calm again, almost painfully ordinary. "Talent," Arthur said softly. "Extraordinary talent almost never announces itself. It hides. especially after life teaches it disappointment. Nathaniel followed his gaze. You really believe she is some kind of musical genius because she heard a damaged note? Arthur chuckled quietly beneath his breath. No, I believe she is extraordinary because she reacted emotionally before intellectually. Nathaniel said nothing. Arthur continued. Most trained musicians identify mistakes after analysis. She felt it instantly, like hearing pain in someone else's voice. The billionaire slipped one hand into his pocket slowly. You sound certain. I am. Nathaniel looked toward Claire again. Something about her irritated him now, though he could not explain why. Perhaps because he disliked mysteries. Perhaps because he disliked realizing he had overlooked something valuable sitting 10 feet away from him for months. Or perhaps because Arthur Whitmore had just made him feel unobservant. And Nathaniel Reed hated feeling unobservant. Then why is she carrying dessert trays instead of performing at Carnegie Hall? Arthur's expression softened with quiet sadness. Life, he answered simply. The old pianist reached for a glass of water near the piano bench. Do you know what the cruelest thing about talent is, Mr. Reed? Nathaniel remained silent. Arthur took a slow sip before continuing. It does not protect people from grief. It does not pay hospital bills. It does not stop funerals. Sometimes the world does not break gifted people loudly. His pale eyes drifted toward Claire again. Sometimes it breaks them quietly. Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar settle into the silence after those words. Not sympathy exactly. Curiosity. Heavy curiosity. Across the restaurant, Claire finally glanced toward them for half a second. Their eyes met briefly across the amber light and reflections of crystal glasses. Hers immediately moved away. But Nathaniel noticed something in them before she turned. Fear. Not fear of him. Fear of being recognized. The rain had stopped by the time the dinner crowd began thinning out, leaving Manhattan wrapped in the glossy midnight quiet that only appeared after expensive restaurants started closing their doors. Inside the Holbrook Lounge, the atmosphere softened into low voices and fading candlelight. Most guests had returned to their lives downtown. Chauffeurs waited outside beneath glowing street lamps. Credit cards disappeared back into tailored jackets. The city resumed its endless movement. But Nathaniel Reed remained seated at table 17 long after his untouched dessert had gone cold. He watched Claire Bennett from across the room with the same concentration he usually reserved for acquisition reports and market forecasts. The strange part was not that Arthur Whitmore believed she was extraordinary. The strange part was that Nathaniel had begun believing it too. Claire moved carefully now, aware of the occasional glances drifting toward her from the remaining guests. She hated attention. That much was obvious. Every movement carried quiet restraint, as though visibility itself felt dangerous. You are staring, Arthur said softly from the piano bench. Nathaniel barely looked away from Claire. I am observing. Arthur smiled faintly. That is usually what powerful men call staring. Nathaniel ignored the comment again. You still have not explained how you know her. I never said I knew her. Arthur rested one weathered hand against the piano keys. I said I recognized her. Nathaniel finally stood and walked toward the piano. The restaurant lights reflected softly across the polished black surface of the Steinway Grand. Recognized from where? Arthur looked toward Claire before answering. Years ago there was a performance at Juilliard. Nathaniel's expression shifted slightly. Juilliard. A private evaluation recital. Invitation only. The room was filled with professors, conductors, critics. Arthur's eyes drifted somewhere distant now, somewhere far beyond Manhattan and marble floors. Most students performed beautifully, technically perfect, predictable. He smiled sadly. Then a 17-year-old girl sat down at the piano and made a room full of experts forget how to breathe. Nathaniel glanced toward Claire again. She was wiping down an empty table near the window now, unaware they were discussing her. Claire Bennett. Arthur nodded slowly. Back then they called her the rarest ear on the East Coast. Nathaniel folded his arms. If she was that gifted, why is she here? Arthur remained quiet for several seconds. Talent attracts admiration, he said carefully. But admiration is not the same thing as protection. Nathaniel did not fully understand the sentence, but something about Arthur's tone stopped him from pushing further. Across the lounge, Claire approached their table carrying fresh coffee for Arthur. You should not still be awake, she told the elderly pianist gently while setting the cup beside him. Your hands shake when you drink espresso this late. Arthur looked amused. And yet somehow you still brought me espresso. Decaf. Arthur sighed dramatically. Cruel girl. For the first time that evening, Claire almost smiled naturally. It changed her entire face. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Not because it made her prettier, though it did, but because it made her look younger. Less guarded. For one brief second, she looked like someone who had not spent years hiding from herself. Then her eyes landed on Nathaniel, and the walls quietly returned. Mr. Reed, she said politely, can I bring you anything else tonight? An answer. Claire blinked once. Excuse me. Nathaniel gestured lightly toward the piano. Arthur says you attended Juilliard. Her expression closed instantly. Arthur says many dramatic things. Claire. Arthur interrupted gently. He is curious. Not dangerous. She gave the old pianist a look that suggested she was unconvinced those two things were different. Nathaniel noticed that too. I am not trying to embarrass you, he said calmly. Then why are you still asking questions? The silence between them tightened softly. Nathaniel was not accustomed to resistance. Most people answered him immediately, eager to impress or cooperate. Claire Bennett spoke to him like his wealth carried no authority at all. And strangely, that made him more interested. Because people do not accidentally hear flaws in piano harmonics from across a crowded restaurant, he answered honestly. Claire looked down briefly at the polished floor. Sometimes old habits stay alive longer than you want them to. Arthur studied her quietly. Music was never a habit for you. Claire did not respond. The old pianist sighed softly and pushed himself up from the bench with visible age in his movements. Play something for him. Claire's head lifted immediately. No, one song. Arthur. 1 minute. Her voice lowered now, almost fragile. Please do not do this. Nathaniel watched the shift carefully. Until now Claire had seemed controlled, calm, but fear had returned to her eyes again. Not fear of failure. Fear of exposure. Arthur looked at her with deep understanding. You cannot spend your whole life pretending you cannot hear yourself anymore. Claire stood completely still. The restaurant around them had nearly emptied now. Only 2 late diners remained near the far windows, quietly finishing wine beneath the dim lights. The city hummed faintly outside. Somewhere in the kitchen, dishes rattled softly in warm water. Nathaniel suddenly realized something unsettling. Claire Bennett was not hiding because she lacked confidence. She was hiding because once upon a time, being seen had cost her something important. Arthur slowly stepped away from the piano bench. I am old, Claire, he said quietly. Humor me. Claire stared at the black and white keys beneath the amber lights. Her breathing slowed almost invisibly. Then she whispered something so softly Nathaniel nearly missed it. I would not know where to begin anymore. Arthur smiled with heartbreaking gentleness. The hands remember long before the heart forgives itself. Claire Bennett stared at the piano as though it belonged to another lifetime. The black lacquer surface reflected the amber chandelier light in soft waves, almost unreal against the quiet emptiness of the restaurant. Arthur Whitmore stood nearby with patient eyes. Nathaniel Reed remained beside table 17, watching more carefully than he intended to. Nobody rushed her. The silence itself seemed to wait. Claire finally shook her head once. I cannot. Arthur tilted his head gently. Or you will not. Her throat tightened slightly. There is a difference. Arthur smiled sadly. Only to people who still believe fear and choice are separate things. Claire lowered her gaze immediately. Nathaniel noticed how her fingers curled lightly against the edge of the tray she still carried. Nervous. Not theatrical nervousness. Real nervousness. The kind people spent years learning how to hide. Claire, Arthur said softly. Do you know why musicians stop playing? She remained quiet. It is rarely because they lose talent. His voice became quieter now, almost swallowed by the empty lounge around them. Most stop because music begins reminding them of things they are trying to survive. Nathaniel saw her breathing shift again. Tiny. Controlled. Like someone trying to hold a door closed against memory. Claire carefully set the tray down onto a nearby table. You should go home, Arthur. Not until you touch the piano. Please. Arthur looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. Your father used to say your hands could hear sadness before your ears did. Nathaniel watched the color leave Claire's face completely. The restaurant suddenly felt colder somehow. You knew my father? She asked quietly. Arthur nodded once. Daniel Bennett was one of the finest cellists I ever performed beside. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Claire stepped backward almost instinctively, stunned. He never mentioned you. Your father did not enjoy speaking about successful people who disappeared after concerts ended. Arthur smiled faintly. He thought musicians should remain human. For the first time all evening, Claire looked emotional enough to lose composure. She folded her arms lightly against herself. That was a long time ago. No, Arthur corrected gently. It only feels that way because grief changes the shape of time. Nathaniel remained completely silent now. Something deeper was unfolding between them, something larger than music. Arthur slowly sat back down beside the piano. After your father passed away, everyone wondered where you went. Claire looked away toward the rain-streaked windows. I did not disappear. Arthur gave her a knowing look. No, you hid. The truth landed softly between them. Not cruel, not judgmental, just painfully accurate. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Nathaniel realized then that he had never once considered what kind of history a waitress might carry. People like him spent years categorizing others quickly. Useful, irrelevant, ambitious, replaceable. Efficient men simplified the world because simplicity created speed. But standing here tonight, Nathaniel suddenly felt ashamed of how little curiosity he had ever shown toward ordinary people. Or perhaps toward people he assumed were ordinary. Claire finally spoke again. After my father died, my mother got sick 6 months later. Her voice remained calm, though every word sounded carefully balanced. Hospital bills replaced piano lessons. Competitions stopped matching. Arthur listened quietly. Juilliard offered scholarships, he said gently. 3 of them. Claire gave a faint laugh without humor. Scholarships do not pay for chemotherapy in Manhattan. Silence followed. Heavy, honest. Nathaniel looked down briefly at his own silver watch. It cost more than most people earned in months. Arthur rested one hand softly against the piano keys. And after your mother? Claire swallowed carefully. After my mother, I could not hear music anymore without hearing goodbye. The old pianist lowered his eyes. Nathaniel felt something uncomfortable tighten in his chest. He understood loss in theory. Everyone did. But wealthy people often experience tragedy differently. Private hospitals. Comfortable grief. Time away from work. Yet Claire spoke about pain the way people spoke about whether they had learned to live inside permanently. Arthur finally asked the question quietly. So you stopped playing? Claire nodded once. At first for a few weeks. Her eyes drifted toward the piano. Then months. Then years. Nathaniel spoke before realizing he intended to. And nobody tried to bring you back? Claire looked at him directly for the first time in several minutes. People like talent when it performs for them, she answered softly. They rarely care what happens to it afterward. The sentence landed harder than she intended. Nathaniel felt it immediately. Claire seemed to realize it too because she looked away a second later. Arthur broke the tension gently. Your father once told me something after hearing you practice. Claire remained still. He said your gift frightened him. A tiny crease appeared between her brows. Frightened him? Arthur nodded slowly. Because you did not play music like a child learning notes. His eyes softened with memory. You played like someone trying to understand human beings. The restaurant had become almost completely silent now. Staff cleaned quietly in distant corners. Outside, headlights drifted through wet Manhattan streets beneath midnight fog. Nathaniel realized he had not checked his phone in nearly an hour. Unheard of for him. Arthur slowly slid away from the piano bench again. I am not asking you to perform for strangers tonight, Claire. His voice carried no pressure now, only warmth. I am asking you to remember that losing people does not mean you must lose yourself with them. Claire stared at the keys for several seconds. Her reflection trembled softly across the black piano surface. Then very slowly, almost like someone approaching sacred ground after years away, she stepped forward. Claire Bennett stopped beside the piano bench without sitting down. The black and white keys stretched before her beneath the warm chandelier light, like a conversation abandoned years ago. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the polished surface. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Arthur Whitmore remained quietly nearby, giving her space the way experienced musicians understood silence. Nathaniel Reed stood several feet away with his hands in his pockets, watching more intently than he realized. Claire lifted one hand slowly toward the keys, then stopped inches above them. Her fingers trembled almost invisibly. Nathaniel noticed immediately. You do not have to prove anything, Arthur said softly. Claire gave the faintest nod. I know, but her voice sounded distant, as though part of her still stood somewhere years behind them. The old pianist studied her carefully. Then what are you afraid of? Claire stared down at the piano, remembering how much I miss it. The honesty of the answer settled heavily into the room. Even Nathaniel looked away briefly after hearing it. Arthur pulled out the piano bench gently. Sit. Claire hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the bench for the first time in nearly 7 years. The movement itself felt sacred somehow. Careful, reverent, painfully unfamiliar. Nathaniel suddenly understood why Arthur had looked emotional earlier. This was not simply a waitress touching a piano. This was someone returning to the only language that had ever truly belonged to her. Claire rested her fingertips lightly against the keys. No sound yet, just contact. Her eyes closed briefly. The restaurant around them seemed to disappear into softer edges. Distant dishwater sounds from the kitchen faded beneath the low hum of Manhattan outside. Somewhere beyond the rain-streaked windows, a taxi horn echoed through the midnight streets. But inside the Holbrook lounge, everything narrowed into silence and breath. Then Claire pressed one single note. Soft, fragile. The sound drifted through the empty restaurant, like something waking up slowly after a long winter. Arthur lowered his eyes immediately. Nathaniel felt an unexpected chill travel down his spine. It was only one note, yet somehow it carried loneliness inside it. Claire pressed another, then another. Simple chords at first. Careful, hesitant, like someone testing whether an old bridge could still hold weight. Nathaniel had attended symphonies before. Charity galas. Private concerts. Wealthy people collected cultural experiences the same way they collected watches and art. But this felt different. There was no performance in it. No ego. Claire was not trying to impress anyone. She sounded like someone speaking quietly to herself after years of silence. Arthur remained completely still near the piano, almost afraid to interrupt the moment with movement. Claire's hands slowly grew steadier. The melody deepened. Not loud. Never loud. Just honest. Nathaniel realized something unsettling then. Claire did not play notes the way other musicians did. She played emotions first, and the notes simply followed behind them. Every pause sounded intentional. Every soft chord carried memory inside it. And somehow the room itself seemed to lean toward her. Nathaniel forgot entirely that he was standing inside a restaurant. Forgotten coffee cooled on empty tables nearby. Candle flames flickered softly against crystal glasses. Beyond the windows, Manhattan remained restless and enormous. But none of it mattered now. Claire Bennett had transformed the air itself. Then suddenly she stopped. Her hands froze above the keys. Her breathing caught sharply. Arthur looked up immediately. Claire stared down at the piano with glassy eyes. I cannot, she whispered. Arthur stepped closer. Claire. She stood abruptly from the bench and turned away, pressing one hand lightly against her mouth as though embarrassed by her own reaction. I thought it would feel smaller after all this time. Her voice trembled now despite her effort to control it. But it still feels exactly the same. Nathaniel watched her carefully. He had spent his entire life around ambitious people, competitive people, people desperate for recognition. But Claire Bennett looked nothing like that. She looked like someone grieving a version of herself she buried alive out of necessity. Arthur spoke gently. Because gifts do not disappear simply because life interrupts them. Claire shook her head. You do not understand. Then help me understand. She looked toward the dark windows instead of at either man. When my mother was dying, music became cruel. The room remained silent around her words. Every competition invitation felt selfish. Every practice session felt selfish. Every applause sounded wrong. Her eyes lowered slowly. People kept telling me I was special while my mother could barely afford medication. Nathaniel felt something twist painfully inside his chest again. Claire continued quietly. Eventually, I started resenting the piano for surviving when everything else did not. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. The old man looked older suddenly. Claire, I know it sounds irrational. No. Arthur interrupted softly. It sounds human. Silence settled again. Nathaniel stared at the piano bench she had just left behind. He realized then that success had always appeared simple from a distance. Wealthy people loved stories about talent rising above hardship because it made the world feel fair. But real life was messier than that. Sometimes extraordinary people disappeared not because they failed, but because survival demanded more immediate sacrifices than dreams could afford. Claire finally turned back toward the piano. Tears never fell. She would not allow that much vulnerability in front of strangers. But Nathaniel noticed the effort it took for her to remain composed. Arthur gently rested one hand on the piano lid. "Your father used to tell audiences something before concerts," he said quietly. Claire looked at him. "He would say music is not valuable because it escapes suffering." Arthur's pale eyes softened. "He said music matters because it teaches people how to carry suffering without becoming cruel." Claire stared at the keys again for a very long time. Then slowly, almost unconsciously, she reached toward the bench once more. Claire lowered herself onto the piano bench again with the slow caution of someone reopening an old wound. The restaurant had become nearly empty now. Chairs rested upside down on distant tables while staff cleaned quietly near the kitchen entrance. The chandeliers dimmed slightly as midnight deepened across Manhattan. Outside the tall windows, rainwater reflected city lights in long rivers of gold and white across the pavement. But inside the Holbrook Lounge, time seemed suspended around the piano. Arthur Whitmore remained standing nearby with one hand resting gently against the polished black surface. Nathaniel Reed leaned silently against the edge of table 17, no longer behaving like a man waiting for entertainment. He looked like a man witnessing something private he was not entirely sure he deserved to see. Claire inhaled slowly. Her fingertips touched the keys again. This time she did not hesitate. The first chord emerged softly beneath the amber lights, low and aching, carrying the weight of memory inside it. Then another followed. Then another. The melody unfolded carefully at first, like footsteps through unfamiliar snow. But within seconds, something changed. Nathaniel felt it immediately. Claire stopped playing cautiously. She stopped thinking about who was listening. Music moved through her now with terrifying honesty. The notes no longer sounded performed. They sounded remembered. Arthur lowered his eyes as emotion crossed his weathered face. He recognized the piece instantly. Debussy, Clair de Lune. Yet somehow Claire transformed it into something quieter and infinitely sadder. The melody drifted through the empty restaurant with heartbreaking restraint. Every pause breathed. Every note carried tenderness, shaped by loss rather than technique. Nathaniel had heard famous pianists before. Technically flawless musicians who performed with precision sharp enough to impress entire concert halls. But Claire Bennett played like someone translating emotions too large for language. The room itself felt altered by it. Candle flames trembled softly beside untouched wine glasses. The city noise outside faded into distant background hum. Even the kitchen staff near the back corridor had stopped cleaning without realizing it. One young dishwasher stood frozen beside a rack of glasses, staring toward the piano with wide eyes. Claire's hands moved naturally now, gracefully, instinctively. The years away from music disappeared beneath her fingertips as though they had never existed. Nathaniel noticed something strange then. Claire never looked at the keys. Her eyes remained lowered somewhere beyond them, focused inward instead of outward. She was not performing for applause. She was surviving through sound. Arthur quietly pulled out a nearby chair and sat down heavily, overcome by memory. Daniel would have cried hearing this. He whispered under his breath. Nathaniel glanced toward the old pianist. She really was that gifted? Arthur let out a faint laugh filled with disbelief. Gifted? His eyes remained fixed on Claire. Mr. Reed, there are technically brilliant musicians everywhere in New York. Conservatories are full of them. He shook his head slowly. But every generation or two, someone appears who does not merely play music. Nathaniel remained silent. Arthur's voice softened. They reveal people to themselves through it. Nathaniel looked back toward Claire. For the first time in years, he felt completely incapable of measuring what he was witnessing. Money could quantify almost everything in his world. Companies, buildings, influence, market value, risk. But this existed outside calculation. Claire reached the center passage of the piece, and suddenly the melody deepened with such raw emotional force that Nathaniel felt his chest tighten unexpectedly. A memory surfaced without permission. His mother sitting beside an old radio late at night, while his father traveled constantly for business. The loneliness in her face, she always tried to hide whenever Nathaniel entered the room as a child. He had not thought about that memory in years. Yet somehow Claire's playing had found it effortlessly. Nathaniel looked away sharply, unsettled by the feeling. Arthur noticed. Now you understand, the old pianist said quietly. Nathaniel did not answer immediately. Claire finished the final notes with extraordinary softness. The last chord faded slowly into silence until only the low hum of Manhattan remained beyond the windows. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence afterward felt sacred somehow. Claire's hands rested motionless above the keys. Her breathing remained uneven. She looked exhausted, as though the music had pulled something deep from inside her that had been buried for years. Then quietly, almost embarrassed by the stillness around her, she stood from the bench. The kitchen staff suddenly remembered themselves and resumed moving awkwardly in the background. One server wiped tears quickly before pretending to organize menus. Arthur remained seated, staring at Claire with shining eyes. "There you are," he whispered again. Claire folded her arms lightly against herself, uncomfortable beneath the attention. It was only one piece. Arthur gave a soft laugh. "No, Claire." His voice carried absolute certainty now. That was 7 years of silence finally speaking. Nathaniel slowly stepped closer toward the piano. Claire noticed immediately and instinctively retreated half a step. The movement was subtle but impossible to miss. Nathaniel stopped walking at once. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nathaniel looked down at the piano keys before meeting her eyes again. "You were right earlier," he said quietly. Claire frowned slightly. "About what?" Nathaniel's expression shifted into something unfamiliar for him. "Humility. I noticed your uniform before I noticed you." The honesty of the sentence surprised even him. Claire stared at him carefully, uncertain whether to trust what she heard. Wealthy men apologized differently than ordinary people, usually with gifts, with influence, with money disguised as kindness. But this sounded painfully sincere. Nathaniel looked toward the piano once more. "That was the most honest thing I have heard in years." Claire lowered her eyes immediately, unable to absorb praise comfortably. Arthur smiled faintly beside them. "True art does not impress people," the old pianist said softly. "It reminds them they still have souls beneath all the noise." The silence after Arthur Whitmore's words lingered softly through the restaurant like the fading echo of a prayer. Claire Bennett stood beside the piano with her arms folded lightly against herself, uncomfortable beneath the tension she had spent years avoiding. The chandeliers above cast warm reflections across the polished floor, while the final employees quietly finished closing duties near the back kitchen corridor. Manhattan beyond the windows remained restless and alive, but inside the Holbrook lounge, something fragile had shifted permanently. Nathaniel Reed had not looked at his phone in nearly 2 hours now. That fact alone would have shocked everyone who worked for him. Yet standing here tonight, expensive schedules and billion-dollar negotiations suddenly felt strangely unimportant compared to the woman still standing beside the piano bench in silence. Arthur slowly rose from his chair with visible effort in his aging hands. "It is late," he said gently, "and my doctor already believes I enjoy ignoring medical advice too much." Claire gave a faint smile despite herself. "Because you do." "True." Arthur picked up his wool coat from the nearby chair. Then his expression softened again as he looked at her. "Do not disappear another 7 years." Claire lowered her eyes immediately. "I cannot promise anything." "No," Arthur said quietly. "But perhaps tonight reminded you that the world lost something important when you stopped." The old pianist stepped closer and kissed her forehead gently with grandfatherly affection. Nathaniel noticed Claire close her eyes for half a second at the gesture, as though kindness itself still startled her sometimes. Arthur then turned toward Nathaniel. "Mr. Reed." "Arthur." The old man studied him carefully. "You are not accustomed to feeling small, are you?" Nathaniel almost smiled at the honesty of the question. "No," Arthur nodded once. "Good. It is healthy occasionally." Nathaniel watched the elderly pianist leave slowly through the front doors into the damp Manhattan night. The restaurant suddenly felt quieter after his absence. Claire began gathering abandoned glasses from nearby tables immediately, retreating toward work the way people retreat toward safety. Nathaniel observed her for several seconds before speaking. "You do that on purpose." Claire did not look up. "Do what?" "Hide inside tasks whenever conversations become personal." Her hands paused briefly against a wine glass before continuing again. "Work is simpler than explaining things." Nathaniel walked slowly toward her table. "You explain yourself very clearly." Claire glanced at him carefully. "Most people do not actually listen." The sentence carried no bitterness, just experience. Nathaniel rested one hand lightly against the back of a chair. "You assumed I was judging you earlier." Claire gave a small humorless laugh. You were. Nathaniel considered denying it. Instead, he surprised himself again. Yes. She finally looked directly at him then. Most wealthy men do. The words were not cruel, just calm, observational. Nathaniel suddenly realized Claire spoke about rich people the way experienced travelers spoke about weather patterns they had already survived. You dislike people with money? He asked quietly. Claire returned her attention to collecting glasses. No. I dislike what money sometimes convinces people about themselves. Nathaniel folded his arms slowly. Meaning? Claire carried the tray toward the service station before answering. That being successful makes them more valuable than everyone else. Her voice remained gentle, or more worthy of being heard. Nathaniel followed her with his eyes. Normally comments like that would have irritated him immediately. Yet tonight he found himself unable to dismiss anything she said because the woman carrying empty coffee cups had just revealed more truth through a piano than most executives managed in entire lifetimes of speaking. Claire returned from the kitchen moments later with her coat folded over one arm. You should go home, Mr. Reed. Nathaniel glanced toward the dark windows. You are still calling me Mr. Reed after tonight? You are still a customer after tonight? Another strange answer. Calm, controlled, but somehow impossible to argue with. Nathaniel studied her quietly. Why did you stop completely? Claire's expression shifted carefully again. We already discussed that. No, Nathaniel replied softly. You explained why you stepped away. You never explained why you never came back. The room fell silent once more. Claire looked down at the silver ring on her right hand before speaking. Because eventually people stop asking. Nathaniel frowned slightly. Claire continued quietly while folding her coat more tightly against herself. At first everyone reaches out. Professors, friends, invitations, opportunities. She looked toward the piano. Then time passes. Her voice remained composed despite the sadness beneath it. The world moves on surprisingly fast when you disappear. Nathaniel understood that feeling differently than she intended. Powerful people lived surrounded by constant attention, yet most of it vanished instantly once status disappeared. Perhaps loneliness simply wore different clothing at different income levels. Claire looked toward the front entrance. I should lock up. Nathaniel hesitated before speaking again. Would you ever perform publicly again? Claire actually laughed softly this time, though exhaustion lived beneath the sound. You ask impossible questions very casually. I am serious. She stared toward the piano for several seconds. I do not know who that version of me even is anymore. Nathaniel followed her gaze. Arthur seemed certain she still exists. Claire tightened her grip slightly around her coat. Arthur remembers me before life became expensive. The sentence lingered heavily between them. Nathaniel suddenly became aware of how easily wealthy people romanticize talent while remaining blind to the practical brutality ordinary survival demanded from everyone else. Claire walked slowly toward the front doors and switched off several hanging lights as she passed beneath them. The restaurant dimmed into softer amber shadows. Nathaniel remained near the piano, staring at the keys she had touched earlier. Claire. She paused near the entrance without turning fully around. Yes. Nathaniel looked at her carefully, almost uncertain of himself now. Tonight was the first time in years I forgot to think about business. Claire studied him quietly from across the darkened lounge. Then she said something so simple it unsettled him more than praise ever could. That probably means you needed tonight more than I did. The streets outside the Holbrook Lounge glistened beneath midnight rain as Claire Bennett stepped out into the cold Manhattan air with her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The city smelled like wet pavement, coffee drifting from late-night cafes, and distant taxi exhaust carried through narrow avenues by the wind. She walked quickly beneath the glow of streetlights, trying to leave the evening behind her before memory settled too deeply into her chest. But some nights refused to disappear quietly. Behind her, Nathaniel Reed exited the restaurant several moments later. His driver immediately stepped out of the black sedan waiting at the curb. Home, sir. Nathaniel glanced toward the direction Claire had already disappeared. Not yet. The driver nodded silently and stepped back inside the car. Nathaniel remained standing beneath the rain-speckled awning, hands inside the pockets of his charcoal coat. For the first time in years, he felt unsettled in a way no boardroom had ever accomplished. Claire Bennett had disrupted something carefully organized inside him. Not because she was beautiful. Manhattan was full of beautiful people. Not because she was talented. Nathaniel had funded entire industries built on exceptional talent. No, Claire unsettled him because she carried extraordinary depth without needing the world to confirm it. And somehow that made his own success feel strangely loud. Across town, Claire descended the narrow subway stairs into the quieter downtown station near Lexington Avenue. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead while tired commuters stood wrapped in winter coats beside faded advertisements and newspaper machines. She sat alone on the bench near the tracks, staring down at her hands. The same hands Arthur Whitmore had once called rare. The same hands she had spent 7 years pretending belonged to someone else. She could still feel the piano keys beneath her fingertips, still hear the final fading notes inside her chest. A train rushed past with a scream of steel against steel, but Claire barely noticed. Her phone buzzed softly inside her coat pocket. One unread message. Arthur Whitmore, your father would have been proud tonight. Claire stared at the screen for a long time before locking the phone again without replying. Some emotions remained too large for words. The next morning, Manhattan returned to its usual pace. Horns echoed between skyscrapers. Steam rose from sidewalk vents. Men in tailored coats rushed toward meetings carrying overpriced coffee and invisible exhaustion. Inside Reed Capital's 42nd floor conference room, Nathaniel Reed sat silently at the head of a 12-foot walnut table while executives presented quarterly projections on a glowing digital screen. The Zurich acquisition could increase annual growth by 14% if negotiations remain favorable through December, one vice president explained confidently. Nathaniel said nothing. His attention drifted instead toward the rain moving softly across the windows behind them. Sir, the executive hesitated nervously. Nathaniel blinked once. Continue. But even he recognized the distraction in his own voice. Halfway through the meeting, he interrupted suddenly. Reschedule the afternoon appointments. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Nathaniel never rescheduled anything. Everything after 2 o'clock, he clarified while standing. I will handle the investor call remotely tonight. Of course, his assistant replied carefully. Nathaniel walked out before anyone could ask questions. 40 minutes later, he stood once again outside the Holbrook Lounge long before evening service had even begun. Through the windows, he could see staff preparing tables beneath the chandeliers, while soft instrumental music drifted faintly into the street each time the front doors opened. Claire moved between tables carrying folded linens, unaware he was there. Nathaniel remained outside longer than necessary. He was not entirely sure why he had come. Curiosity alone no longer explained it. Finally, he stepped inside. Claire looked up from arranging silverware near the center tables. Surprise crossed her face immediately. Mr. Reed. Nathaniel. Right. She glanced toward the nearly empty room. The restaurant does not open for another hour. I know. Claire studied him quietly now. Then why are you here? Nathaniel looked toward the piano. Because I could not stop thinking about last night. Her expression tightened slightly. That is dangerous. Why? Claire folded a linen napkin carefully before answering. Because people often mistake being moved for understanding. Nathaniel absorbed the sentence silently. She always spoke like that. Calmly. Precisely. As though every word had already survived long periods of silence before being allowed into the world. Nathaniel stepped closer. Arthur told me your professors expected you to become one of the greatest pianists of your generation. Claire returned her attention to the table instead of his eyes. Arthur exaggerates. Does he? Silence. Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a small white envelope gently onto the table beside her folded linens. Claire frowned slightly. What is that? An invitation. To what? A private performance at Lincoln Hall next month. Claire froze completely. Nathaniel, the artistic director, owes me several favors. Her eyes hardened instantly. No, the speed of the refusal surprised him. You have not even opened it. I do not need to. Claire stepped away from the table now, putting physical distance between herself and the envelope. You heard me play once, and now you think I need saving. Nathaniel frowned. That is not what this is. It always becomes that eventually. Her voice remained calm, but sadness lived underneath every word. People with money hear talent and immediately start trying to rescue it. Nathaniel looked genuinely confused. Is that wrong? Claire stared at him quietly for several seconds. Then she said something that silenced him completely. You do not rescue people by finally noticing they exist. The restaurant fell still around them. Even distant kitchen sounds seemed quieter afterward. Nathaniel looked at her as though she had reached directly through every layer of confidence he had spent decades building. Claire glanced toward the envelope one final time before pushing it gently back toward him across the tablecloth. What I lost cannot be fixed with concert halls or wealthy connections. Her eyes softened slightly then. Not angry, just tired. And not everything broken wants to become visible again. 3 weeks passed after Claire Bennett returned Nathaniel Reed's invitation unopened across the white linen tablecloth at the Holbrook Lounge. Manhattan moved forward the way it always did. Fast, loud, unforgivingly indifferent. Rainstorms came and disappeared above the skyline. Markets shifted. Executives celebrated acquisitions over expensive whiskey while taxis flooded wet intersections beneath glowing billboards downtown. But certain moments refused to leave quietly. Nathaniel discovered that truth every evening he entered the restaurant and heard music drifting softly from Arthur Whitmore's piano while Claire moved silently between tables pretending her hands belonged only to trays and coffee cups. He stopped offering opportunities after that night. No more invitations. No more attempts to rescue her through influence disguised as generosity. Claire had made something painfully clear. She did not need a billionaire deciding her life should become visible again. And strangely, Nathaniel respected her more because of it. So instead, he listened. Some nights, he arrived late after investor meetings and sat quietly near the piano without opening his phone once. Other nights, Claire barely spoke more than necessary while refilling his coffee. Yet something subtle changed between them. The silence no longer felt defensive. One snowy evening in early December, Nathaniel entered the restaurant to find Arthur Whitmore absent from the piano for the first time since he had met him. The empty bench beneath the chandelier lights looked strangely lonely. Claire noticed Nathaniel looking toward it while hanging her coat near the service station. "Arthur is at Mount Sinai," she said softly. Nathaniel turned immediately. "What happened?" Claire lowered her eyes briefly. "His heart medication stopped working properly last week." The restaurant noise suddenly felt distant again. "Is he all right?" "The doctors are hopeful." But her voice carried worry she could not fully hide. Nathaniel removed his gloves slowly. "Have you visited him?" Claire nodded once. "Yesterday." She hesitated briefly before adding, "He asked about you." Nathaniel looked surprised. "Why?" Claire almost smiled faintly. "Because apparently you became his favorite arrogant billionaire." Nathaniel actually laughed softly under his breath. The sound surprised both of them. Claire looked at him differently afterward. Less like a customer. More like a person slowly becoming real. 2 nights later, Nathaniel arrived after 9 o'clock and found the restaurant unusually quiet. Snow drifted softly outside the windows while warm amber lights reflected against the dark street beyond. Claire stood alone beside the piano holding a folded piece of paper. "Arthur gave this to me at the hospital," she said quietly when Nathaniel approached. "What is it?" Claire looked down at the paper carefully. "A program schedule." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "For what?" Her eyes lifted toward him slowly. "Lincoln Hall." Silence settled between them instantly. Nathaniel stared at her, almost afraid to speak too quickly. "Claire." He arranged everything before getting sick. Her voice trembled faintly despite her effort to remain composed. Apparently, he spent the last 2 weeks terrifying artistic directors until they agreed. Nathaniel could almost hear Arthur's dry humor in the gesture. Claire unfolded the paper carefully. "The concert is in 4 days." Nathaniel looked toward the piano. "And?" Claire swallowed slowly. "And Arthur says if I do not perform, he will personally haunt me out of spite." A small laugh escaped her then. Fragile. Exhausted. Human. Nathaniel watched her quietly. "Do you want to do it?" Claire stared down at the program in her hands. Snow continued drifting outside beneath the streetlights. "I do not know if I remember how to stand in front of people anymore." Nathaniel stepped closer carefully. "You remember how to make people feel something." Claire looked up at him. "That is not the same thing. Maybe it matters more." The room fell silent again. Then Nathaniel reached toward the piano bench and gently pulled it away from the keys. Claire frowned slightly. "What are you doing?" "Making a deal." Nathaniel sat down on the bench awkwardly, completely unfamiliar beside the instrument. "Play one song for me every night until the concert." Claire blinked in confusion. "Why?" Nathaniel looked almost embarrassed by his own honesty. "Because if you are terrified, Then perhaps you should not relearn how to be seen by strangers first. Claire stared at him quietly. And you think playing for you is easier? Nathaniel gave a faint smile. No, but I think you trust me more than you did 3 weeks ago. The truth of the sentence lingered gently between them. Claire looked toward the empty piano bench beside him. Then slowly, after several seconds, she sat down. Nathaniel moved slightly farther away to give her space. Claire rested her fingertips against the keys while snow softened the city outside. Arthur once told me something before my first competition recital, she said quietly. Nathaniel waited. He said audiences do not remember perfection. Her eyes lowered toward the piano. They remember honesty. Nathaniel nodded once. Arthur seems right about most things. Claire glanced toward him briefly. Not everything. No. A faint sadness touched her expression. He still believes broken things always want to be repaired. Nathaniel looked at her carefully then. Maybe he simply believes some things are too beautiful to remain hidden forever. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she began to play softly beneath the amber lights while snow drifted silently through Manhattan outside the windows. And for the first time in years, Claire Bennett no longer sounded like someone mourning who she used to be. She sounded like someone slowly remembering she was still there all along.